There is an ancient story of an African girl enslaved to a sad and angry woman. And the woman felt insecure and unimportant, and she thought that having a baby would change this. But she kept failing. And so she tried to fix her sadness by using the enslaved girl to have a baby, forcing her into a relationship and pregnancy. And when the enslaved girl realized she was pregnant, a hatred welled up inside of her. And when the woman saw this hatred, she became very angry. And with all of her power and meanness, the woman made life so unbearable for the enslaved girl that she ran away. And alone and pregnant, she wandered through the desert, trying to find her way home. Have you ever felt like the enslaved girl wandering in the desert alone, trying to get home? Or have you ever felt hatred well up inside of you, but there is nothing you can do with it? Or do you know what the other woman is feeling? That combination of failure and hurting that makes you so angry and mean. How are we supposed to step into this story? How does God participate in a story like this with all of its ugly emotions? Genesis 6:16 tells us the girl's name was Hagar. Her enslavers never call her by name, but the scroll does, and God does. And we see her sitting beside a spring in the desert because God sees her there. And God asks her where she came from and where she's going. Have you been asked those questions? Tell me what happened. Or, where do you think you're going now? Hagar's answer is honest and simple. She says, I am fleeing. I've met Hagar many times. I know that look of exhaustion, that ratty bag with nothing in it, the pregnant and hungry belly, the smell of bad shoes that crossed a muddy river and landed in a cold prison. She is fleeing. I remember the first time I met Hagar. I showed her to her room in our church guest house, and there were so many people that night, exhausted and hungry. But I remember so vividly how delicate her hands were, and round her belly, and smelly her shoes. She had no family at all. There was no one who could call her by name. Where do you think you're going now? God asks. In the ancient story, God listens to Hagar's version of events, and then God tells her the end of her story. And it's not a very happy story, but it's her story. And it's full of suffering, but now with promise. And Hagar responds in the most astounding way. She names God. You, the God who sees me. This enslaved, pregnant girl in the middle of nowhere is the first human in Scripture to name God. Can you imagine naming God? Can you imagine feeling so seen by God that you could put it into a name? There is another woman who is hurting and scared. Life and happiness had been bleeding out of her for 12 years, and looking for help just made things worse. And her hurt made her unlovable and unacceptable in her community. But she pushed through a crowd anyway to get to Jesus. What do you think her stomach felt like shoving through that crowd of shame? 12 years of built-up hurt and powerlessness and embarrassment are heavy. But she pushed through. And when she got to Jesus, all of her hurt vanished. She knew it immediately. And Jesus knew it too. He stops, Mark says, and he looks around to see. In the press of the crowd, Jesus wants to see. And the hurting and the healed woman is caught in all of her shame and all of her faith. And she is seen by Jesus. And she falls down in front of everyone and she has to tell her story. What if at that moment this woman had the courage to name Jesus? I think she could rightly say, "You, the God who sees me." We never know the woman's name, but Jesus certainly names her. He calls her daughter. What would it be like to be seen and then tell your story and then be called that? The ancient story gets much more difficult. The enslaved girl has to return to her slavery and she gives birth. And I don't know where she finds the strength to do this, but it comes from somewhere. We've seen so many people deported back to horrific conditions in the country they first fled, and their messages are desperate and scared, and their options are nothing. I remember the first time I got a call like that. A father had just gotten off a deportation plane and he was holding his daughter who was burning with fever, and there was no one to help him. And "Brother," he said on the telephone, "I think we're going to die here." Hagar's situation is so precarious and so powerless that a single action from her child sends them spiraling into horrific danger. The ancient Hebrew says the boy was seen scoffing. That's it. And the sad and angry woman uses all of her power to cast the mother and child out again into the desert. Why is the world so dangerous? How is it that meanness can turn vulnerability into horror so quickly? The Bible is filled with sad and devastating scenes. But of them all, I find the next part of this story the hardest to read. In the desert, Hagar's water runs out, and her mama's strength runs out too. And with nothing left, she gives up, knowing that her child will die and she can do nothing. She lays him down under a bush and walks off into the desert far enough that she wouldn't have to see her child die. Once I met this Hagar, she was trembling. I remember the hospital smell of antiseptic and stress, and her eyes were clenched shut, and her chin was pressed down into her armpit, and she was unable to see her child hurting through all of her powerlessness. The ancient Hebrew says, she lifted up her voice and wept. I can still hear it. It's from deep in the chest. The God who sees is now the God who hears. In the ancient story, God hears the crying and comes to Hagar as the child dies and says, "Arise, take the child by the hand." And when she takes the child by the hand, she can suddenly see a well there in the desert, and the wilderness becomes a home. Do you think that well was always there, but she couldn't see it? Or do you think that by taking the dying child's hand, she somehow found herself in a place full of provision? What if being heard meant you could see? Or what if reaching out meant you found a well? Now, just after Jesus names that woman who had hemorrhaged for 12 years, daughter, we see Jesus go into the room of a little 12-year-old girl who has died. And the desperate parents are there, and a few of the disciples, and I always imagine that room being dark and terrifying, containing all powerlessness. Have you ever had to go into a room like that, the scariest and saddest place in your life? Peter never forgot what he saw and heard in that room. The Gospel of Mark even switches over into the language Jesus spoke, like Peter was telling him. This is exactly what it sounded like. Jesus said, Talitha cum, arise, my child. And then Jesus, they all saw it, took the child by the hand. The God who sees is the God who hears, and somehow the God who takes by the hand. And the 12-year-old girl gets up, and Jesus calls for some food. When we feel the saddest and the meanest and the most powerless, I imagine that dark room and hearing Jesus's resurrection words. I imagine watching Hagar pull her child up from under the bush and then fill her bag with water. I love that Jesus called for some food. I would love to be a part of that church that says, we'll bring some food. But imagine being the church so consumed with the Incarnation that we are reaching out with Jesus to take by the hand. Imagine being the church that is so consumed with the Incarnation that we see the way God sees. God becomes flesh to see and hear and reach out, and then to walk with us in the way. And if we worship the God who sees, if we praise the God who hears and the God who takes by the hand, can we also bear that image? What if we lived like that? Like we were never alone? What if we lived seen and heard and held? What if we lived in participation with God seeing and hearing and holding? This is what preparing for Advent is. It's about remembering God's incarnation and begging for it to continue. We're asking God to craft new eyes that see, and new ears that hear, and hands with the strength to reach out in resurrection power. Amen.